the same concept applies across vendors in general. I found American vendors are better about this. Like they don't need to be turned off usually, unless they are like a very strong monopoly or a larger company. That's where you typically have to do that. But if it's a smaller 3PL, they tend to be more reasonable around negotiations.
Walk through the actual order of operations here. So step one, you
Mhm.
literally go to your 3PL or like just stop shipping with a certain shipping carrier, right? So let's say it's
Yeah, I
FedEx.
mean, we'll go to FedEx and say, hey, look, we need to negotiate rates. This is just not competitive relative to what else we're receiving quotes wise, and we'll show them the rates we're being quoted from another carrier, whether it's LaserShip or someone else, and they'll just say no usually, and we'll say, okay, great, we're turning you off then, and we will just turn them off. And we don't lose money because we use Ship Haven, which basically beats their rates no matter what. It's a great hat service. We haven't had any issues using them in 4 or 5 years. I don't have any relationship with them, but
Yeah, yeah.
um, that's how we do it. So
Yeah, okay. And then once you do that, they're willing to say like, well, hold on, maybe we
the
can
rep
find
will
something that
come right
works.
back every time, 100% of the time, never fails. The rep comes right back. They're like, oh no, what can we do to win your business back? Blah blah blah, and just works every time with the shipping carriers. Unfortunately, I mean, like obviously I prefer not to do this all, but it's the only thing that works.
So incredibly actionable. I'm going to immediately turn around and reach out to my to some of my clients and just say like, go do this thing now because it is so awesome. Have you done this across the board with shipping carriers? Like,
Yeah,
or is it
probably we've probably done this like 20 or 30 times now.
what do you how much money do you think that has resulted in saving
Like
like
millions of
on
millions of
average?
dollars.
Really?
Um, oh, that's millions of dollars like total, but on average, I'd say probably the first time you do this, you'll save anywhere from 10% to 30% on shipping, and that depends if you integrate other. You should be integrating a lot of the smaller carriers too, like LaserShip. They're great; they totally work, and it depends on where you are geographically, because some of them will not service you. Like for example, DHL, LaserShip, and a few of these other guys, they won't operate in some of the smaller states. So it does depend on
Yeah.
where you are, but it's definitely worth looking into. And if you just Google it, you'll find a bunch of them.
If you're working with a 3PL
Mhm.
to do this sort of thing, are you like doing that in concert with your 3PL at all, or are you just calling the shipping carrier directly?
But it depends on the 3PL and your relationship with the 3PL, and if you're using your own postage accounts or their postage accounts, etc. But the same concept applies across vendors in general. I found American vendors are better about this; like they don't need to be turned off usually, unless they are like a very strong monopoly or a larger company. That's where you typically have to do that. But if it's a smaller 3PL, they tend to be more reasonable around negotiations. Um, and I would really approach with 3PLs where we're more collaborative. So we'd work with them to say redesign packaging, et cetera, or just go and look at how they're picking and packing our products. Um, yeah.
Makes sense. Is what about let's take that out to that next level then, vendors in
Mhm.
general. You have this piece
Yes,
of
let's do it.
advice that you say just declare that you're going to pay them 3% less over the next 18 months. Like tell me like this is a bold move and I think a lot of people would feel nervous about doing this. I don't think you would, but tell me about this strategy.
Yeah, so there's no real downside to doing this. It works best if you can send it from someone kind of authoritative, like the CEO or the CFO. I like the CFO because everyone just assumes the CFO is kind of like, you know, tough. And it gives us someone to blame because usually like the CEO might be negotiating directly or working directly in product dev with say a manufacturer, right? So you could just kind of force that on the CFO and that way you don't torch the relationship. But just sending out an email to all of your vendors saying that you're now paying 3% less. And if anyone sends you an invoice without having, I guess, read that email, you just subtract 3% and send it back and just remit that amount of money and say, did you not read the email that we sent you? And this works probably it'll probably work with 85 to 90% of your vendors.
When you say it works, do you mean you have to get to the point where you just pay the 3% less? Like they won't actually uh,
Oh,
or will they or were they most times will they just invoice you 3% less?
I'd say probably 60% of them will invoice you 3% less. The other ones will be surprised, but that's just their fault for not checking their email.
That's so funny. And I like the CFO move too. It totally makes sense. Everybody just expects the CFO is just like some numbers monster sitting in a corner somewhere trying to slash, whatever, the personality
Totally,
lists.
totally.
Like they don't, whatever. As a CEO could be like, oh, I'm so sorry, my CFO is like really holding me to it, so
Yeah,
uh,
basically in any supply chain book, you'll see that they recommend separating out like the purchaser from the relationship of like from being the same person who negotiates, if that makes sense. So if your job was to be the person pulling the trigger on purchase orders, I want someone else who negotiates because you can't help but build a relationship with whoever you're working with on the other side, right?
yeah,
So
I
it just
remember
makes things easier.
this advice reminds me a little bit of, I remember hearing Moise Ali say a long time ago, like everything is negotiable. It's way more negotiable than you think, and you just never try it. And you should negotiate everything you can, and
Mhm.
every 2 and 3% you could possibly get, you should take.
Yeah, the way
So
we look
yeah,
at it is just like a lot of suppliers will just declare a 3% price increase. So why not go the other way? I mean, I'll just declare a 3% decrease.
that's a
Why
great
not?
great way of framing it. Yeah,
Yeah,
I love that. Anything else on the baseline, like sort of
with vendors.
vendor relationship stuff? Like
Totally.
you've got a note here about getting
Let's go into
FaceTime
it.
with people. Like I'm curious to hear you talk
Mhm.
about how that plays in, and sort of um, anything else big picture with like actionable ways to reduce costs with vendors.
Yeah, totally. So a lot of D2C brands end up dealing with manufacturers that are overseas. I think it's important to keep in mind that other cultures are much more FaceTime heavy. And even in the US, there's still like you show up, they'll take you much more seriously. They'll be much more willing to negotiate than if you didn't show up. But overseas, that's probably like another 3 to 4 times as important. So I think actually going on trips to China, India, Vietnam, wherever you source from is really, really critical. And then remembering that there's like a bit of a big man culture in Asia, and this is pervasive across a bunch of countries there where people don't like it if you're and even in the US, right? Like people don't like it if they negotiate with you directly purely on cost. They'll feel like they lost. No one likes to feel like they lost a negotiation. What we found works better is saying, hey, let's work on a new product together that cuts out a lot of the unnecessary things that our customers don't care about and re-engineer it together, even if you are essentially just beating them down on price. Just phrasing it differently tends to help a lot. Or even pushing for something like terms where they don't realize, like, they don't think of it the same way as just a pure cash discount, even though it functionally is, right? And really diving into the term side, I think understanding the financing structure of whoever you're negotiating against is really, really important. Keep in mind, if you're an exporter, you have access to state subsidized financing almost 100% of the time. Pretty much every country offers some sort of state subsidized financing function for exporters. So in China, for example, the Sinosure. In India, there's a bunch of subsidies available, and it's important just to take. It doesn't take too long, maybe a few hours, just to Google around and see what's available to them. And often the counterparty won't realize that their cost of financing is exponentially lower than yours. So if you're a D2C brand that's pretty small, let's say 5 to 20 million, you're probably paying for a debt that's not personally guaranteed. You're probably paying anywhere from, I want to say, 10% to 18% in interest rates, depending on, again, no PHE, depending on how large
Yeah,
you are, what your
yeah,
balance sheet looks like.
sounds about
They're
right.
paying way less than that. They're paying like, in some cases, they're paying like 3% or something, just because the state wants to subsidize exports so much, so heavily. So if you work with them around that, you can often find bigger price breaks that way around terms than just straight up cost.
So basically, you're bringing that to them, telling them that, and
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, can you finance this instead of me?" Basically, I'm going to pay a little bit less because you just have access to better rates than I do. I mean, how are you actually leveraging that bit of information into the negotiation?
Yeah, that's totally it. Or just getting them to do things like keep more inventory on hand because their cost of holding that inventory is much lower than yours, right? So you say, look, there's no risk for you because you're still holding the inventory. There's a little bit of risk. It's not like they're shipping it to you and you have it and they don't, right? So you say, hey, why don't you guys hold more inventory in stock? So that way there's less of a wait time between you placing a purchase order and getting your product still. So there's still that same net benefit, but they're just holding it on their balance sheet, if that makes sense.
Totally makes
Um,
sense. And then are you framing that at that point as this will help me grow, which will help me generate more business for you, and by sort of essentially, I mean, it's essentially a cash conversion cycle issue at that point,
mhm.
right? You're now being able to reduce your lead time, make smaller orders, and then say to them at the same time, like, this is going to help fund my business's growth. I'm therefore going to order more from you. It's just this is I need you to leverage your better terms than mine in order to make that happen. And now everybody
Yeah,
wins.
yeah, exactly. And most of the time, they're
Yeah.
totally willing. They just didn't understand that dynamic. And again, maybe a lot of brands don't understand the dynamic where it is cheaper for the vendor to hold the inventory on their books. So,
Yeah, it's also 100% true if you say those things. It's like this is like such a fundamental pain point for e-commerce brands that
and
like
there's no
if
markup, right? Like
yeah,
for
right.
them, it's just the cost of whatever their inputs were. So say labor, material cogs, etc. For you, there's still the manufacturer markup, right? So like their cost, the baseline for what they're holding in inventory is lower too. plus the cost of financing. So
Yep.
it's a win-win.